Okay, so today we're going to be doing two things. Firstly, I'll go over the British parliamentary format of debating. This is the most commonly used format at my school since I study in the UK. After this, I'll quickly also go over the World Schools format. For the purposes of this camp, I'm going to treat the two as being very similar, and the main difference is going to be the British parliamentary format includes 8 people, while World Schools includes 6. And so we'll be basically switching between the two formats to accommodate for numbers. So depending on how many students are there, you'll switch between which format you're doing. Great. Okay, so let's get into it. The basic format for British parliamentary is that there are 4 teams. So that's probably quite different to what you might be used to. It's not just 2 teams of debaters. You're going to have 4 teams. There are 2 speakers on each debating team, and the team names, which is like nice to know because I'll probably be using them in the future, are in order: opening government, opening opposition, closing government, closing opposition. It'll be easier to understand later on what these teams are really doing. The 2 government teams are arguing for the motion. So, in other words, taking an example from yesterday, um, if the topic was about like this house prefers endless summer to endless winter, then uh, the government or proposition teams would be supporting the summer side, and the opposition teams would be supporting the winter side. In terms of timing, you'll be given 15 minutes of prep time, or at least that's the official amount. I think for this camp, I'll probably be giving you slightly more, maybe 20 minutes. And then there are going to be 8 debaters. Each of them can speak for up to 5 minutes, but I don't expect you to be hitting 5 minutes. I think considering most of you are beginners, it's completely reasonable for you to be giving just 1 minute speeches as well. That's totally fine. Uh, and so that's the basic format. Let's get more into how the order of these speeches works. Um, Within your 5 minute speech, there are 3 things you should be doing. Firstly, you should give a short introduction, which is just explaining what your main points are, and uh, almost like a table of contents at the start of a book. It should just be like very short, 1 sentence, almost bullet points of what the rest of your speech is going to be about. So hopefully, in your 15, 20 minutes of prep time, maybe you've thought of 3 arguments for your side, and there should be reasons under each argument explaining why they're true. But in the introduction, you just kind of list your main 3 arguments so that the audience and the judge understands what the overall structure of your speech is going to be. Next, what you do is you rebut or deconstruct the opposition's arguments. So let's say you're speaking second in the debate, then whoever spoke before you, it's your job to look at their arguments and try disproving or deconstructing them. So you'll spend about a minute, hopefully, on that. And finally, the main chunk of your speech should be about your own arguments, your side's arguments, and showing why uh, there are more like positives that come out if you follow your side of the debate. So in the case of the endless summer versus endless winter, in the rebuttal, if you're on the winter side, let's say, and someone's just spoken about summer, in the rebuttal, you would first deconstruct all the positives that were said about summer, while in the substantive, you would explain the positives of winter. So those are kind of the 2 sides of it. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, this is quite important. Yes, go ahead, Byron.
So, do we announce the points that we are going to be deconstructing on the opposite side?
Yes, you should be at the start of your speech, you should announce almost everything you're about to do in brief. So it should be maybe 15, 20-second summary, but you should be announcing every bit, really. Um,
Yeah.
Great. Good question. Uh, and everyone else also feel free to ask questions. You will have to raise your hand because I won't see it otherwise. But yeah, Abir.
These in order for, so first you start with prime minister and then leader of opposition and then like
Yeah, so I'm just about to go into that. You can see from the arrows that's going to be the order of how people speak.
that. Okay.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's go a bit more into the speaking order and the roles of each speaker. You can see here, it's just this kind of alternating pattern between the left-hand side, which is the government side, which is for the motion, and the opposition side on the right, which is against the motion. So you'll have one speaker from each side alternating during this debate. More crucially, what you need to understand here is that the four teams, which I mentioned previously, are split into these groups of two. So you have the prime minister and the deputy prime minister on one team, but the member of government and the government whip are on a different team. So even though these two teams are on the same side of the motion and they're going to be saying somewhat similar things, right? They are still different teams, and so they are not going to be collaborating with each other. And the goal of each team is to defeat the other three. So you are trying to beat the team which is on your side of the debate as well. And this is something which is somewhat unique about the British parliamentary format. So I think, yeah, Ayush.
So if I'm a member of government,
Mhm.
how do I beat the opening opposition? How do I beat the prime minister if I'm a member of government? Okay, I obviously can't rebut their arguments
Mhm.
because I want to argue for my own points. So how can like the closing government beat the opening government?
Yeah, good question. I will get into this more maybe in like later. Um, yeah, I'll get into this a bit later, but for the quick answer is although you cannot directly rebut your previous team if they're on the same side as you can only rebut the opposition team. What you can do is explain why your arguments either affect more people or affect these people to a greater extent. So, in other words, just explaining yes, their argument might be true, but it's not as important as our argument. And if you're able to show that, then you can beat your opening team. But I'll get more
And
into that.
will
Yeah.
will these be like will the debates in this class be scored with a winner? Like the winner of this debate is the closing government. Will they be in this class?
So for the purposes of this camp, there won't be like scores. It'll be just feedback focused, and the judges will be giving general and then individual feedback, but no results, unless I change my mind at some point. But yeah. Okay. Next is what's called a point of information or a POI. In simple terms, what this is that you interrupt someone in the middle of their speech, say POI, and if they accept the POI, then you're allowed to ask a quick question. So, in other words, you don't have to wait until your speech, or maybe you've already given your speech, and so you won't have another chance to respond to them. So this gives you an opportunity to ask a question and really interact with the speaker very spontaneously. More technical wise, the POI can only be asked after the first minute of a speech. So you cannot be interrupting the speaker in the first 60 seconds. And theoretically, it can also only be asked up until the fourth minute, which means the last minute of a speech, since the maximum is 5 minutes, is also protected time where the speaker cannot be interrupted. So there are 3 minutes in the middle of someone's speech where you're allowed to ask a POI of them. The POI can last a maximum of 15 seconds. The reason why this is important is because quite often students like ramble on a bit too much. So make sure you have a very clear POI in your head. Maybe even write down your POI before asking it. So you can just read off your piece of paper what your POI is. And just make sure it's very brief. And finally, a POI is something that's a one-off thing. So you don't ask a POI and then just keep talking after that and keep responding to the speaker. It's something where you unmute, say your bit, and then mute, and you're not allowed to say anything after that. So the speaker can like completely ignore your POI, and you're not allowed to do anything about it. Or the speaker can just brush it off, like act as if they've responded to it, and that's totally fine as well. So the person asking the POI does not have a right to keep engaging with the speaker. Okay. Overall, the point of a POI is to engage with the speaker more spontaneously and possibly catch the opposition off guard. So they're probably not expecting it. They won't always know how to answer your question. And if they don't effectively answer it, that's quite damaging for their case. Hopefully that makes sense, but it'll be much clearer if there are a few more examples during the practice debates themselves. And I do encourage you to take and deliver POIs. Okay, before I go into speaker roles, any other questions?
You're lagging.
Am I lagging? Could someone else confirm? Are people able
I
to
think
hear?
his screen is.
So is it multiple people who think I'm lagging right now? Okay. Uh, 1 second then. I'll try switching locations. Just give me a minute.
The screen hasn't gone back.
No,
Black.
he closed the video.
Just 1 second. Give me a minute and I'll see if I can find a place with better Wi-Fi. Okay. Could everyone confirm again? Can you hear me properly? Can you see everything clearly?
Yes.
Yes, now we can.
Now? Great. Is there anything you missed on either the previous slide or Aditya? Could you...
And so regarding POIs, is it better to initially respond to the POI, or would you say that it really doesn't matter whether you respond to it or not?
Definitely, you should be responding to the POI. The judge will like very easily see whether you responded to it or not, and if you don't respond to it effectively, that will be damaging to your case. So
Okay.
although the person asking the POI can't do anything if you don't respond to it, the judge will be like taking points off, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, so now getting into the speaker roles. I'll go kind of like layer by layer. So as you saw in the diagram, they're kind of like in layers of two. So I'll just go through it slowly. The first speaker, which is so the first speaker for government side, their main purpose is to create a framework for the debate. In other words, the motion's often quite vague, and you have to make sure that all 8 people are working on the same basis. So you should be defining a few key terms, making sure everyone understands your perspective on the debate. Otherwise, what can happen is the 2 or 4 teams have interpreted the debate in very different ways, which makes it quite confusing when they're giving their arguments. Yes, Bhairav?
So, are you allowed to raise a POI on someone on your own team?
No, you're not. So you're not allowed to rebut people directly on your own team, and you're not allowed to ask POIs to your own team. You
What
can
about
only compare your arguments during your speech. Okay.
but can you also for the people on your side, like for the 4 different teams or the 2 in the government side, can they ask POIs to each other?
No, so that's what I'm trying to say. They can't.
Okay, thank you.
Vandan?
Okay, so there are supposed to be two people on each team. So does that mean that both of us will explain what points we have thought about, or we both have to give different speeches?
So you'll be working together in the 15 to 20 minutes when preparing, and you'll think of various arguments. Let's say maybe you think of 3 arguments. After that, you should be distributing between your two
Okay.
speeches what you're going to say.
So we decide who will say exactly what, and then we have to say it. Okay.
Yes. So the speeches should be different
Okay.
because you're like kind of splitting the content. Okay. Cool. Moving on. The next thing the first speaker does is introduce the overall case for their team. They're going to be giving most of the arguments. So in a situation where you create 3 arguments, most likely the first speaker takes 2 of them and the second speaker takes 1, because the second speaker is also given the responsibility of deconstructing the opposition's arguments, while the first speaker should be focusing more on their own team's arguments. Hopefully that makes sense. On the other side, you have the opposition and their first speaker. The main objectives here are relatively simple. They have to deconstruct the government's first speaker's speech and their arguments, since that's the speaker that's gone right before them, and they introduce their own opposition arguments. And the last thing here, which talks about a counter model, I'll go into that a bit more, but basically what that's trying to say is maybe the motion is something along the lines of banning gambling for side proposition. So what opposition can do is say, oh, we're not going to ban gambling, and we don't like the status quo either. We don't like the current world. Instead, we're going to propose an alternative policy, which might be to heavily tax the winnings from gambling, something along those lines. So an alternative policy that opposition thinks works better to achieve the same goal. Okay. So now, yeah. Okay, moving on to the next 2 sets of speakers. So these 2 speakers are on the same team as the 2 speakers I just spoke about. So these 4 as together are consist of 2 of the 4 teams, sorry. Okay, on the left here, you have the second speaker on the government side. Their role is a bit more complex, possibly, because they have to do quite a few things. Firstly, they have to rebut the opposition points. Then they have to rebuild their own points. What this means is your previous speaker, the person on your team, gave 2 arguments, and then the opposition team had a speaker, and they most likely rebutted those 2 arguments. So what rebuilding is going over those 2 arguments again in a way that doesn't just repeat what your partner said, but instead addresses the concerns that were brought up by the opposition. So in a sense, rebutting the rebuttal. And hopefully by now everyone understands what I mean by rebuttal.
I can't hear you.
Vandan, could you confirm? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay, Sitara, could you it might be something on your end, so
Oh no,
if
now I can hear you.
okay, cool. So yeah, rebuilding a case is basically rebutting the rebuttal. Finally, you then give your own new arguments where this is something that you and your partner must have decided beforehand that we're going to split up our arguments, and the second speaker will take this argument. So you very well could have a new argument which your partner has not yet mentioned. And finally, because you are the last speaker on your team, since it's a team of 2 people, you should also be explaining just holistically overall, after, even though it's only been 3 speeches, why is your team winning? Because every last speaker on their team should be doing this. So there are 4 people who are all the kind of last speakers on their team, and they should be explaining why their team is currently winning, because they'll have no other chance after that. Sitara, did you have a question?
I just wanted to ask you if you could repeat that point.
Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize it. First, you rebut opposition points. Then you rebuild your own points, which is rebutting the rebuttal. Then you give your own new arguments, which you previously decided with your partner they were not going to say and that you would be doing it in your speech. And finally, you explain why your team as a whole is winning. Malolan?
Can you just explain the second point, rebuild OG case in Deputy Prime Minister?
Okay, so let's say I'll give an example, and then I'll move on after that. But for an example, let's say it's the endless summer, endless winter example, and I'm saying, oh, endless summer is great because you can go to the beach and, like there are a lot of like fun activities you can do in the summer. And then the opposition team comes up and says, oh, wait, um, it's not really all that great because you probably still have school like 9 months a year, and realistically, you'll only be able to do all those fun activities like when you actually have summer holidays, and that amount of time doesn't change. So they've tried rebutting me, and now my partner is going to stand up and try rebuilding my case by saying something like, oh, yeah, like you can do these kinds of summer activities more during the summer holidays, but even when you have school, you do have a lot of free time. And so even during the school year, during December, January, February, you should still be able to go out to the beach and enjoy yourself, right? The school time isn't so busy that it totally negates all of that. So in that case, now you've had three speakers talking about the same point. The first speaker introduced it, the second speaker tried rebutting it, and then the third speaker reinforced the point again. Okay, I'll now move on. So the second speaker on opposition, it's a very similar thing. It's almost identical, really. I won't go into too much. Basically, you rebut. Now you're rebutting two speakers instead of just one. You rebuild, give new arguments, explain why you're winning. It's all the same. Okay, now going into the last four speakers. I'll go a bit more into the member of government and member of opposition on the next slide, but basically their goal is to provide an extension. And what that means is provide something new to the debate, which hasn't come up previously. There are two other teams which have already spoken, and they've most likely said the most obvious points already. And if you repeat what they've said, which is quite like likely to happen if you don't think things through, because in your prep time, you don't know what they're about to say. You only have your 15-20 minutes. You're probably going to come up with the same points as them, which is quite unfortunate because saying the same points is not useful at all, because it looks like you're just copying them. So what you have to do is very carefully look through your notes, look through what you've prepared, and choose only the things which haven't yet been said, and focus more on them to the point where they sound like the most important things in the debate. I'll go a bit more into what that really looks like. But finally, the last two speakers, speakers 7 and 8, their goal is to summarize the debate. They're going to summarize what everyone said and explain why their partner and their team is winning compared to all of the other three teams. So in this summarization, it should be a bit of a biased adjudication. You're basically acting like a judge and like going through each team and saying, okay, they said this and they gave this argument, but my partner's arguments still are more important because of XYZ reasons. Finally, you then rebut your opponents, and you're not allowed to give any new arguments. So all of your speech should be summarizing, rebutting, things along those lines, not actually bringing up new content, because you're literally at the end of the debate. If you gave a new argument, there would be no way to engage with it or for the other team to respond to it, which would be quite unfair. And finally, what you do is weigh over your opening. what this means is what I touched on before, in the sense that there are two teams which are on the same side of the debate. So like the first opposition team and the second opposition team. So the second opposition team needs to explicitly explain to me why they win instead of the first opposition team. So as I said before, you're not allowed to rebut that team, but you can explain why your arguments are more important. This is quite a difficult thing to do, so I don't necessarily expect it from you yet, but it's nice to know that it's something you should be and can do, which is explain why your team, as a closing team, wins instead of your opening team. And finally, the extension, which speakers 5 and 6 need to be doing. As I said, it's about bringing something new into the debate, which hasn't been said before. So this could be a new argument, new rebuttal, a new a new group of people which haven't been discussed before. So maybe there's a debate and a lot of people have talked about how students are affected and how teachers are affected. You could bring an extension that talks about how parents are affected, and that would probably be something very new. So just anything that contributes to the debate in a way that hasn't been talked about before. Okay, that's all for the speaker roles. Any questions before I move on to the last bit? And honestly, all of this, it'll be a lot clearer once you do a practice debate and kind of see how it all works. Bhairav?
So is the leader of opposition allowed to rebut the prime minister? And other similarly, is the even numbered person supposed to allowed to rebut the person before them who just spoke before them?
Yeah, and in fact, that is exactly what you should be doing. So all of the even numbered speakers, which will be on opposition, can rebut the odd number speakers, which are like the government side, and vice versa. So that's exactly what you should be doing. And it would be a mistake not to rebut the speaker right before you. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Honestly, this isn't too important. I'll move on. These last two slides are about different types of motions that come up. So first is a this house would motion. And an example is this house would implement a sugar tax, which I went over with, I guess, half of the group yesterday. Maybe the other half might have talked about it. I'm not sure. But the point of this type of motion is implementing a policy. In other words, in this example, the government would be enacting a policy that taxes sugar. So it's a real action which is being taken. What this means is that the government side has to be very clear about how exactly the policy will be implemented, because there are a lot of details which are important. And if you don't explain them, then it's going to be a very messy and unclear debate. So for the tax, a very obvious thing which should be mentioned is how much is the tax, right? Is it a 1% tax? Is it a 5% tax? Is it a 10% tax? So all of that makes a big difference as to the arguments which will be set in the debate. And this is kind of what I was talking about at the start as well, about laying out a groundwork so that all four teams interpret the motion in the same way. And past that, your goal should be explaining what's the problem. In this case, maybe it's obesity, right? And then you should be explaining how does your solution actually address the problem? Why and how will taxing sugar decrease obesity, right? So those are the steps you should be taking. And then the opposition kind of does the opposite. It explains why does the solution not solve the problem? Why does it cause even more and greater harms? So maybe the opposition's going to show that, oh, it doesn't actually work. Obesity won't decrease, right? Things along those lines. Or they can give harms for unrelated topics, so not related to obesity, about how maybe it's more difficult for the poor to buy food. And if food's getting more expensive, that could be damaging. So things along those lines. The overall message is it's a very tangible policy which has real world impacts. And so that's what you should be focusing on. On the other hand, the other types of motions here, on the left-hand side are this house believes that, this house supports, and this house prefers. You can see these kinds of like short forms of them are used quite often, but the TH always stands for this house. It's all just like fancy words, but it's all quite straightforward. All of these three types on the left-hand side are theoretical. So it's more on the side of maybe ethics or just what you think is the right thing to do. Things more along those lines. It's not a real policy being implemented. It's just what you think is right or wrong. So you're looking at two different worlds and explaining why one's better. And then finally, another type of motion is this house regrets, which an example of that would be this house regrets the like rise of TikTok, which means currently TikTok has become very popular, at least in some countries. I know it's banned in India. But what side government would then be trying to say is if TikTok never became popular, that would be a better world. And it's all about things in the current world which they think we'd be better off without. Hopefully that makes sense. Any questions? That's the end of the British parliamentary bit. The world schools bit is very short, so like hopefully just 5 minutes. Abir?
What does THBT stand for?
So all of the THs stand for this house. And then more specifically here, you have this house believes that. So for example, this house believes that everyone should, you know, like play a musical instrument. And then the government side will be, oh, it's quite good for your mental health or something. I don't know.
And then the THS stands for this house sees.
This house supports. So this house supports the the popularity of Netflix. I don't know. But they're all quite similar, honestly. It's more the overall message for all three of them is the same.
They are just different. They have the same meaning, but they are different words.
Yeah, basically. Think of it like that. Great. And in the example I gave about like the musical instrument, you can see it's not an actual policy. It's not like the government's going to require people to play a musical instrument, which would be a very different debate, right? If there is a real policy being implemented. Since it's that this house believes that people should play musical instruments, then it's more just about the theoretical benefits, which is a very different thing. Okay. Finally, the world schools format. As I said before, the main difference in our case is just going to be how world schools uses 6 people as opposed to 8 people. And there are going to be 2 teams with 3 speakers on each team. Proposition argues for the motion, opposition argues against it. The rest of it's all the same. It's just that there are 6 speeches instead of 8. Here is the speaking order. It's also the same, just alternating. And so the only like real difference here is what? Sorry, some barking. The only real difference is how there are like 3 people on each team. And so the third speaker needs to like give a different speech compared to the third or fourth speakers on the British parliamentary side. For the first 4 speakers, you can think of them as identical. So regardless of whether you're doing the British parliamentary format or world schools, for the first 4 speakers, just act in the same way. For the third speaker, there's just a bit more that needs to be done. So you need to do your rebuttal. You need to provide some substantive, possibly, but the main purpose of your speech is kind of the summarizing bit of summarizing the debate, comparing the 2 teams' contributions to the debate, and explaining why you won. So it's a bit of an amalgamation of kind of multiple speeches in the British parliamentary format. So you're doing a bit of the rebuttal and a bit of the argumentation, but you're also doing the summarization and the holistic overview. I don't want to go on too long, honestly, so I'll end it there. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can go into the practice debate.